Hey, best friend. This is Kimya Motley of KimyaMotley.com. I am a mom, an author, an advocate. I am the CEO of Haven of Light International, and I'm also a survivor of gun violence due to domestic violence. And my daughter is also a survivor of gun violence due to domestic violence. And if you want to know more about me, or our story, you can go to KimyaMotley.com. Or if you want to know more about our organization, you can go to havenoflightint.org. But today I want to talk to you about Black and Blue officer involved domestic violence. Okay, so before I start talking, I'm going to give you a trigger warning because I could possibly say something in the course of this video that could trigger some negative emotion in you. And if that happens, I need you to inbox me so we could talk about it, because I don't want to trigger anything in you from any past negative experiences without giving you the opportunity to discuss it. Okay. All right. So I was doing some research actually on domestic violence in professional sports, domestic violence in the NFL, NBA, MLB, all of that. I was looking specifically for domestic violence policies in the workplace. And what I found blew my mind. You know, everybody is up in arms about domestic violence in the NFL, and well, rightfully they should be, right? Because athletes are role models, and when they do things like that, it casts a shadow, it casts something ugly, right, upon the world of sports. However, we're overlooking this whole other group of people that are supposed to be role models too. Law enforcement officers. Did you know that law enforcement families have domestic violence at a rate 2 to 4 times higher than that of the general public? 40% of law enforcement families deal with domestic violence. I didn't say 4, I didn't say 14, I said 40. That's a huge number, folks. A huge number. We definitely need to shine a light on that, right? Don't you think? So, I was really thinking that I started thinking really deep into this, right? So many of you know my story. In 2011, I gave you the trigger at the beginning, so here we go. In 2011, my ex-husband, I asked my ex-husband for a divorce, and we'd been married 4 years, and it was an abusive marriage, okay? And at the conclusion of that 4 years, when I asked for a divorce, he tried to kill me. He shot me multiple times. He shot my daughter, who was 10 years old at the time, one time in the head. Neither of us were expected to live, but we did by God's grace. And that is why today I do a lot of talking about domestic violence, in case you wanted to know. So, and I'm a domestic violence nerd, if you will, because I do a whole lot of research. I want to learn all about it, that I can. So, you don't just wake up one day to get shot by your husband. And I was not quiet about it. In the beginning, I was. I did not share a whole lot of information because I was afraid. Okay. But as the violence escalated, I would call the police. I would call the police on him, thinking that they were going to save me from what it was he was doing. They did not. Oftentimes, when law enforcement showed up at my house, they took his side. And mostly because when you've been attacked, like, well, for myself, I was yelling and screaming, and I was the one that was like, help me, help me. I was irate, and he was cool as a cucumber. So they really didn't know how to identify who the primary aggressor was, right? So I've always thought, well, they act that way because they need mandatory training. I still believe that. Not going to change my mind about that. But when I read this research, I said, man, this thing is much deeper than anybody could possibly think, right? So when I started my organization, I had the wives of some police officers call me and tell me that they needed help, that they could not report the violence because it wasn't going to be taken seriously, and they didn't have resources to help them. And so I thought, how sad is that when you're in a physically abusive relationship and you cannot get any help for it whatsoever. So then I thought, okay, more with my organization. Women were calling me saying that this same type of thing was happening to them when they would call law enforcement because domestic violence was happening. The law enforcement would turn on them and they were re-victimized. It's like, this is bananas, okay? So as I was doing the research, trying to find out more about this phenomenon, a lot of times they were saying, hey, number one, there's not a lot of research on it out there. And I wonder why. There's not a whole lot of statistics out there because there's not a centralized database that all this information goes to. And perhaps that's what needs to happen, but there's not. But a lot of times they were saying that because the work of police officers is so stressful, this is why they're committing domestic violence. I say hogwash to that, because if they don't haul off and punch their captain in the face, that means they have self-control. That means they could keep from hitting their wives or partners in the face. But that's another story for another time. We're going to stick to the facts. Okay, so what I loved about what I found is that there are two forces, one in Chicago, one in Nashville, that have implemented officer-involved domestic violence protocols, or they have policies within that office that addresses it. Because one of the complaints of the wives and the partners of these officers is that they were worried about retaliation from their husbands, or they were worried about retaliation from other officers, y'all. Okay, they were worried that the cases were not going to be handled appropriately, and many times they were not processed in the way that they should. And a lot of times the other officers didn't even believe the partners of these officers when they said this domestic violence was going on. So they need a policy. They need a whole separate group of people within that department that deals with officer-involved domestic violence. And those two cities have it. Also, I found that Florida and New Jersey have this protocol throughout the state. So apparently the law enforcement officers in the state, in those two states, it's uniform. So, I think that's great, right? Now, I live in Georgia. I was looking up information for Georgia, could not find any. That's not to say it doesn't exist. I just couldn't find it, but that I will. Okay. So, thing about it is that there is so much information that I really want to discuss with you, but I just wanted to shine a little bit of light on it today to give you something to think about. Okay. There are three areas that I feel that we really need to hone in, to focus in on this officer involved domestic violence so that we could do something to end it. I'm not saying any of this because, hey, I think all police officers are bad or anything like that, because I said, my hair is all over the place. It's because I said 40% of officer families are involved with domestic violence. That means there's 60% that are not, right? Okay, so for those that are, we need greater accountability, right? We need mandatory domestic violence training for law enforcement officers. And we also need accessible resources for their partners so they can feel like, that we've created a safe space for them to come to be able to get help without fear of retaliation. So those are the three areas I just want you all to think about until I come back and we discuss some more of this later. All right. So listen, if you want to reach me, you want to find me, you can find me on KimyaMotley.com. Go there and subscribe to my email list. You can also find me on all social media. That is Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, LinkedIn. I think that's all of them. You can find me Reddit. You can find me there as well. And I've written a book called Born of Violence. You can find that on Amazon.com. And I've also, I've written a course. When my book was released in 2017, 1 month after its release, it went to number 4 on the Amazon list for hot new releases. So I've written a whole course to teach you how to write your book too. Okay. So you can find that information on KimyaMotley.com as well. So listen, you can rebuild your life one day at a time. And I mean rebuild your life after any tragedy, one day at a time, and with God by your side. See you later.